Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap. I'm really excited about this one. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to watch it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have one polling question during today's webinar, so hopefully we can get everybody engaged. And we are doing a drawing at the end of today's webinar for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is DevSecOps, Best Practices for Enterprises. Our speakers today are Shiri Arad Ivtsan, who is a Director of Product Management at WhiteSource, and Brian Dawson, who is a Director and DevOps Evangelist at CloudBees. Hey guys, thanks so much for joining me today. I am just so excited to have you guys both on this webinar because I know you're both are amazing speakers. So lots of great information on tap. So Brian, I know you're going to get things started for us. So yeah. I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and let you dive right on in.
Well, thank you, Charlene. I'm excited to get started, and I thank WhiteSource for having me. It's a pleasure to conduct this session with them, and thank you all for joining us. Because in my family, and I guess I'd say with my colleagues at work, I have a bit of a reputation as a troublemaker. I'm going to start this session out by making a little trouble. I know you joined a DevSecOps webinar, but I'm going to tell you DevSecOps as a term is just wrong. It's redundant. It is a DevOps anti-pattern. And really it's a misnomer of what we need to accomplish. And I expect that Shiri may jump in and tell me I'm wrong. We'll see, but just in case to hedge that a little bit. While I say DevSecOps is wrong, it is the way that DevOps has matured and matured without security being considered a core component justifies a separate term that specifically calls out security as a key component in the DevOps process and projects inclusion of security. And as we talk through not only some of the practices of DevSecOps, I will look to touch a bit upon the culture that will speak to why it is justifiable and valuable to send this signal that security is included. But I do want to start by framing our thinking around the fact that DevSecOps is a wrong term. And Shiri, it's fine if you say you disagree with me and I'm wrong. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I would say that, DevOps is sort of, running fast and automating everything, but security is sort of left behind. And I think that the term DevSecOps is really there to emphasize that security is part of DevOps. So maybe, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need the term of DevSecOps. But I believe that with, looking at the last 5-7 years, how DevOps was shaping, I think security was a little left behind, right? We see a lot of enterprising building those security teams that are completely redundant or completely divided from the development. And I think that the idea of DevSecOps and this term is to make sure that the DevOps and security teams are working together. And I think this is the point of our webinar today. So hopefully we will be able to give some, best practices and tools to drive this, to remove the friction between security and DevOps. So this is my view of this.
I love it, Shiri, and I will both. I'm going to be contradictions today. I both love that you say in an ideal world we would need it, and I'm going to play the role of both a cynic. Hey, it's bad, but you know, and then with that, an idealist. In an ideal world, it should just be DevOps. But you know, I'll also say I agree with you fully, and I stand corrected. With that said, let's take a quick look, and I'm sure most of us know what DevOps is. I will tell you though that if I talk to 10 different people, I tend to hear DevOps described 10 different ways. So I want to take an opportunity to level set as we talk about DevSecOps and DevOps and where they overlap. What is my definition of DevOps? Well, to me, DevOps is not a tool. DevOps is not even necessarily a practice. It is a culture where the stakeholders in the software development and delivery process align around the shared priority of delivering quality software repeatedly, rapidly, so you get fast feedback, and then notably reliably. You may start to get some hints to where, you know, I'm going to go with DevSecOps. Now, we talk a lot about continuous integration, continuous delivery, the process, practices, culture, and tools, or process, practices, tools that support that. But the way I look at these things is these are component processes and practices that support a DevOps culture or DevOps principles in an organization. And a key thing to call out here is the fact that it really is about making a change, validating that change, deploying that change, going all the way to the right, gathering feedback and observing, learning from that and adjusting, and doing this in a continuous loop. What's also important to note is that we're doing this incrementally and on the backbone of the automation of continuous integration, continuous delivery, and for some continuous deployment. So when we pair these together, the reason why I say DevSecOps is wrong or is it's a misnomer is all of the elements of DevOps as it's defined here support the idea that there is a security posture. And what I like to say is DevOps really is couched. DevOps and its component practices, agile, continuous integration, and continuous delivery are about establishing iterative work, fast feedback loops, driven via automation. So you are ensuring reliability. You are ensuring repeatability, which then leads to ensuring quality. And I contend if you don't have secure software, you don't have quality software, right? So again, we'll hark back to this. I believe that there is benefit to signaling inclusion and collaboration of DevOps culture by using the DevSecOps term, but the security priorities of DevSecOps should already be addressed in the definition of DevOps. So let's pull back up and take a look at the DevOps process in another light, using, you know, the very common infinity loop, what I'll call the continuous DevOps process, right? Where we start with a plan. Ultimately, we code that plan. We build and integrate our software. Then we go through test and validation. Eventually, we release, deploy, and ultimately operate that software. And akin to how I defined the kind of learn and observe loop, we then monitor, learn, and we start the loop again. Now, when we look at DevOps in this context of this infinity loop, it leads me to want to go into a poll and ask the audience here, where does DevSecOps belong? And we'll start a poll in a minute. This is a multi-choice poll. I will ask one, answer one is left-hand side, you know, shift left in application development or engineering, right, in the code and build phases. Or should it live sort of right-hand side? Is it deployed in the release and operate phases? Or maybe quality assurance should be responsible for it and manage it in the test phases. Or, you know, like we see a lot, it's none of that. We just need a team of dedicated security experts that are the, to use a term Charlene used earlier, that are the throats we choke when something goes wrong with security. Or E, is it none of the above?
All right, guys, we actually just had a slight technical glitch and the poll for some reason did not launch. So Brian, if you will just go ahead and start, maybe just go back to your presentation. I'll get the poll reloaded up for you and we'll push it out, but I'll let you know when it's ready again. So
Perfect.
but yeah,
So
sorry
maybe
about
I
that.
can maybe I can jump in regarding the 2 slides back. I mean,
Okay, let's jump
don't
back.
you? Let's jump back.
Yeah, there you go. This,
Another slide back, yeah. So we say iterative and agile, and this is sort of very different from how we perceive security, right? Security teams are very, risk aware. They don't want to release anything that is not completely perfect because, we will be exposed. And I think that one of the main risks or one of the main challenges when implementing this is sort of, building that trust within the security teams that everything will be okay, and sort of shifting the mindset, not only of the developers and teaching them about security, but also teaching security teams DevOps.
yes, yes. And if I may add, Shiri, where we're getting the poll relaunch, right? One of the reasons, and I think as many of us maybe have here, have either had the opportunity to talk to Patrick Dubois or Chris Beitart, who founded DevOps Days. And one of the things that I found really interesting when I've had the opportunity to talk to them is that they were really focused on collaboration, right? They saw that dev and ops were oftentimes solving the same problem, but they were solving them from different directions and taking an adversarial approach instead of a collaborative approach. And I love what you're calling out about security and kind of education alignment on both sides being needed, because I think what oftentimes we see is developer sees traditional security as a blocker, and security sees our DevOps teams as trying to push them to the side and move faster than they can ensure security. So
Exactly.
to multiple points you've made, right? Just like DevOps reduces the tension between dev and ops, DevSecOps seeks to reduce the tension between dev and security and get them aligned on the same goals.
All right, guys, we have the poll ready finally for you. Again, our apologies on that, but there's the poll. Should be up on your screen now. Where does DevSecOps belong?
Right. We're in the process, and I'm sorry, Charlene, if I may,
go right ahead.
Clarify. So where in the process should security practice be implemented? Who should own them? Application development, operations, quality assurance, dedicated security team, none of the above, or you can answer multiple choice.
Exactly. So go ahead and make your selections. And while we are waiting for everybody to do that, just a quick reminder that we are going to have a question and answer period at the end of today's webinar. So if you have a question for Brian or Shiri, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. You don't have to wait for that question and answer period to come up to submit your question. You can go ahead and get it in the queue at any time. All right, guys, I think we are pretty much ready. I'm going to go ahead and close out the polling question now in 3, 2, 1. We'll take a look at the results here. There's some interesting results. Where does DevSecOps belong? You guys go ahead and talk about the results there.
Yeah, awesome. This is really interesting to see. And before I and do a dramatic unveil of what the answer is, I like to call out that it's very interesting and I actually think promising when we talk about where we need to shift as an org, that a number of people are reflecting that security practices belong in application development. What is really interesting is to see that as we go further left to right and we land at a dedicated security team, fewer people answered a dedicated security team. Now, I suspect that some of the people that answered none of the above are going to speak to this. Where does it belong? Everywhere. At every stage of the process, harking back to what we talked about DevOps and the automation foundation and the collaboration foundation of DevOps, well, that speaks to the fact that security practices of various types belong throughout the entire DevOps process or SDLC. Development should carry some ownership. In the delivery process, we should carry some ownership. Operations and QA participating between the development and delivery space. And then in production, of course, we still need to continue to monitor, track security, be prepared to learn, observe, react, and adjust. Now, I like to share some charts from the NIST Institute that I had pulled last year. So this is 2019 data, but for illustrative purposes, it's still valuable. You'll see the question was asked is, who's responsible for running the application security testing for your organization work group? Who is responsible for final acceptance of the testing results and any corrective actions resulting from that testing? And there's a number of ways to interpret the patterns, but I'd like to call out that it's interesting to see that the group responsible for corrective action, by and large, is the development team. Yet, when we look at who's doing the testing, it is largely driven by external security consultants, internal security team, i.e. our dedicated security team, and then we see a steep drop-off. And this highlights for me that we're finding, when we look at this chart, that organizations are recognizing security is required of everyone, but by and large, there's this split. It's driven or owned by the security organization, yet when stuff goes awry, it's going to be the development team's backlog that is blown up, and the development team that is going to carry the responsibility and the burden. And this results in that adversarial mindset. It results in a mindset for development that security is a blocker. They're disruptive. They're out of band, validating the code I've built and delivered, finding problems with it, and then throwing my work off, right? And what we would want to see in an ideal world is a more even split across these stakeholders and ownership, not only for testing, but ownership for acceptance and ownership for a corrective action plan. When we talk about DevOps as an extension of Agile, there is an emphasis on knowledge distribution. There is an emphasis on distribution of responsibility. And as we shift from a traditional DevOps mindset to a DevSecOps mindset, those same principles should carry forward. Another survey question to look at that I find interesting that speaks to some of the practices we'll follow up is, when asked what the biggest obstacles for security are, we start to find that a lack of an integrated and automated workflow across these groups or functions in an organization is a common theme, right? We see at the top, bridging the gap between software development, security, and compliance. Silos between security, development, and business units. Lack of application security skills, tools, and methods. Lack of integrated security and remediation lifecycle workflow, baking in the shared security practices into, speaking from a Jenkins perspective here, right, into my my Jenkins pipeline, or the pipeline of whatever your orchestration and automation solution is. And then overall, just a fear of making changes and modifying changes. So again, I think this speaks to that on all tiers of what I call the DevOps Trinity: people and culture, process and practices, tools and technology. We need to be working to bridge the gaps between the functional silos of development, QA, operations, and security to build a platform where they can collaborate and share in those responsibilities. So I want to talk to a little bit about some very high-level practices or areas of focus as we break down development, delivery, and production areas of concern for security. Starting on the left hand with development, as you build out your workflow or your pipeline and your set of practices, right? It's important to do things such as establish role-based access controls and permissions, as well as checks on those permissions to ensure that the right people are making the right changes, and that's compound, right? You need to ensure that team members, as much as you can control it, don't have access to change portions of the application, the environment, or the overall tech stack that compromise security. But then you also need to ensure that when they make those changes, there's a level of traceability and visibility or process, such as peer review on pull requests, to ensure that they're making the right changes. You need to ensure that you enable phase gates, right? Don't just scan code for the sake of scanning code in your CI loop or downstream in your CD loop, but continually and deliberately think about what test you're performing, ensuring you perform the right test, and then ensure that you establish thresholds or phase gates that have to be passed for the code or the changes to move further down the pipeline. Now, before I talk about delivery and production, I know that Shiri is going to go into much more detail around development practices. And Shiri, do you have anything to share in advance of your double click into development?
Yeah, I think what you just said actually sums up to actionable information. I mean, we have to make sure that we give developers both the actionable information that they need in order to take actions, and also to make sure that that action can be automated. So as you said, if we look back at the old or traditional model, we see that the developers just end up doing most of the remediation work anyway, since they're the one actually fixing the vulnerabilities, upgrading the versions. So making them own security in a way that is easy for them, that integrates into their existing platforms, that doesn't require any context switch. I mean, we cannot expect developers to go into, large security reports and going through them and reading about each and every vulnerability. When we give information to developers, we need to make sure that it's very precise, very short, and that most of it is actually automated and within the platform that they're using. So within the IDE. It can be in GitHub, it can be in Jenkins, whatever platform that they're using, but we need to make sure that we highlight and make them aware of the security in their tools.
Great, thank you for sharing that, and I do look forward to hearing more details on it later in the session here. Before we get over to Shiri, though, to double click on the development process, I want to talk a bit about delivery, and these are high-level examples, right? They're not comprehensive or necessarily holistic. But as we start to look at delivery, right, we move from build, plan, code, build, test, and transition to release. We need to ensure that our delivery pipeline is immutable, right? I can't manipulate workflow, and I love how some of our other colleagues in the space use the supply chain terminology or analogy, right? This is really about managing the goods, the supply chain for the raw goods going into your finished product, which is a deployed application to your customer. And that involves managing mutability of your pipeline, of your application and tech stack components, and your environments. You need to ensure that as changes occur, they're detected, captured, analyzed, and where necessary, right, where they hit critical areas, that you're able to support an approval process. And then, as we've talked about, right, we want to automate everything, right? I like to believe that most humans are well-intended. I like to believe I certainly am. But the biggest errors and risks in software and software delivery tend to be due to human error. So as much as we can automate the common rote processes, we can mitigate error, but you know what? Failures are going to happen. So we also have to be positioned to have a level of automatic response to critical failures, violations, or vulnerabilities that we detect during the delivery process. And then lastly, we ultimately have this whether big bang, progressive, hidden behind feature flags, leveraging canary deployment, any of the buzzwords, practices I can call out. Eventually, we have to land this stuff on a server, deploy it to our customers, And what we need to be able to ensure is that if we find a vulnerability, we have a quick way to mitigate that vulnerability without having to go through the process and risk of the big bang rollback or redeployment. What are some ways that we can do that? One is, as I've said, we use things like canary deployments, right, to test kind of the overall deployment in an isolated manner. Or we could move to a level of feature management, leveraging feature flagging to wrap features in feature flags, where we can then deploy things such as a kill switch. If we find that a given feature has compromised our security posture, cut it off, right? We also still, in the worst case, need to support graceful recovery and rollbacks. And we just need to ensure that we are testing our production deployment process prior to the final deployment, i.e. we're deploying as we go through the earlier stages of the process. And our production run and activity should be integrated and automated in a way that similar to what Shiri said, that we're constantly garnering relevant intelligence around security risk, vulnerabilities, risky behaviors of our users, and we are sharing the key and appropriate information back downstream, right, to operations, QA, and development. So, I'll conclude my portion with saying this: in DevOps, right, DevSecOps, while I can argue as an idealist that it's an incorrect term, we do still have ground to close in terms of relationships between these teams and how we conceptually view security within a DevOps software development lifecycle. And where we need to get and where we should be is where DevSecOps is DevOps and security is everywhere. Where we're thinking about security all the way from the defined plan stage within business, we're constantly thinking about and supporting security hygiene in the development stage, the operation stage, and even as our customers engage with the application, we continue to take a security posture there. So, I encourage anybody here who is pursuing DevOps to view DevSecOps as a key, core, and required component of your DevOps implementation. So with that, I'm excited to hand it over to Shiri to talk about, to answer the 3W questions of DevSecOps for us. And to ensure that I am not distracting Shiri, I will turn off my camera while she presents. So Shiri, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. So I think we definitely understood the why. I mean, we know that we need to make sure that security is part of DevOps, and we need to make sure that DevSecOps is something that we implement in our organization, but is something that ideally should just be part of our everyday life in the DevOps world. So now let's try and dive deeper into the whys, so into the W's, so who, when, and what. We understand how important the security is throughout the life cycle, and we understand that we need to integrate it to the existing workflow, similar to how operation and tests are integrated with DevOps approach. So whether we call it DevSecOps or not, we understand that the mindset should change with regards to how everyone in the organization, and specifically the enterprise organizations, just sees security. So the first question is really, who owns security in the age of DevSecOps? And let's try to answer that first one. An immediate answer may have been the CISO, but in fact, it's not the security teams in most cases who report to the CISO, but actually the development teams. And one thing we've actually learned in recent years is that today applications are more than just code that is being shipped to production. First of all, there is the pace. So the pace is being, faster and faster as we go. And also there are multiple mechanisms like, access control, domain name services, network, transport and encryption. And this kind of infrastructure is just our reality for security teams and for development teams in enterprises. And the reality is just they can't keep up with the complexity, but mostly with the pace of today's software world and today's life cycle. So if we go to the next slide, we understood that developers are owning security. The next question is when. I mean, when should we integrate security as part of the life cycle? And I think that viewing the poll answers, it's pretty clear. I mean, first of all, it's everywhere, but second of all, it's as left as we can in the life cycle. So everything that we can do in the planning or coding stage that will enhance the security is definitely a must-have. So I would recommend, and we will look at the best practices in a second, but we can see here that this is a classic software development lifecycle, and the best thing would be to start in the point that is easiest for you as security teams or as organizations. You know, Brian mentioned that iterative improvement. So iterative improvement would mean that you choose to start with something that is maybe not the best, but you definitely go ahead and you improve as you progress with it. So I would recommend to start as left as you can. I can give an example for the build stage, right? The build stage already has some automatic tests running, right? You can fail the build if something functional is not working correctly, if you have a functional bug. So the same way exactly is how you deal with security. Another example can be code, right? My developers are looking at the IDE and they are, for example, looking for matches and looking for open source component. Why not highlighting the security aspect in the IDE? So all kinds of small, quick tools that can give developers the way to improve iteratively. I think that this would be definitely the best approach. And the next question, if we jump to the next step, is what? I mean, what are the benefits of actually shifting left, as I just mentioned? So we all know that fixing a quality bug in production costs way more than it is during planning or even during coding stage. But in the security world, it's even more expensive, right? You are exposed to vulnerabilities that can affect customers' confidence. They can affect your entire company, basically, right? Security is not only developers' problem, and it's not only the CISO problem, it's the entire board's problem. If there is a security issue, everyone pays it. So security and quality are actually serious threats to the cost of the project, and not only to the cost, but also to the actual quality. So it actually reduces costs and improves ROI to enhance the security in the left side. So coding and building will be the first point to start with. And if we go to the next slide, I wanted to discuss a little bit about why security cannot be the bottleneck at the end of the development process, right? It needs to be integrated in each and every part of this, from coding to development to the release and to the monitoring. And these are some of the best practices to actually enhance or even drive DevSecOps in your organization. So we can go to the next slide. And I think that having developers as a key role in securing application and, you know, achieving the DevSecOps objectives, but also the operational work of security testing must be moved from that dedicated security team that we're all familiar with into the hands of the developers. And this would enable both developers to actually rapidly integrate the results of let's say, security testing into their code. We can't forget that the purpose of the DevOps philosophy is actually to reduce the administrative work of software development teams. So we want to get working code into production quickly. And everything that basically would hold us back is a problem. And usually there is sort of a friction between, going quickly to market and the security aspect. And what we believe is that if you have the right processes and the development teams are aware of the security, this can definitely be mitigated to the minimal. And if we go to the next slide, I think that, of course, security cannot be the bottleneck at the end of the process. And what we want to do is we want to actually empower developers to own security by giving them the right tools. So we sort of discussed it briefly before, but I really want to touch upon the role of the developer in DevSecOps versus the role of governance or security. So what we do is, as we said, we meet the developers where they are right now. We cannot distract them from the work. We cannot slow down the process, but we need to give them some tools to actually enhance security. On the other hand, we still have the role of the governance solutions or the security teams. They are the ones who have to actually set the policies and have the visibility of what's going on within the organization, right? So reports like how good are we progressing? How fast did it take the development teams to remediate vulnerability? Are we getting better or worse in handling the security aspect? These are questions that need to be asked and answered by the security teams who have that visibility. And I think that this is one of the biggest challenges today when implementing DevSecOps is having just basically asking those questions. I think we don't ask these questions often enough.
If I may, Shiri, to also just emphasize and underscore something that you brought up is it's not only aligning them with the right tools, right? But in that process, having your security team and security experts arm your developers with the right knowledge, right? And continually building up an understanding of what key vulnerabilities and threats are, key security practices are, so they begin to ingrain more and more of that knowledge into their development teams.
Exactly. And training is an important part. I will touch upon it in a second. And I definitely agree. I think that giving the developers the right, not only the right tools, but also the right knowledge and also the right processes, which is actually the next slide. So processes are something that is super important when we're dealing with something that is new to the organization. And we already have existing processes, right? We have the process of the software lifecycle. We know that we code, then we build, then we package, and then we deploy. So in those steps of the process, what we would want to do is emphasize the security aspect in each and every one of them. So in the coding part, it would actually be to choose the right component from the earliest stages. Let's say that I'm a developer and I have to develop a new functionality, and I have to choose an open source library to do that. And I have multiple options. Today, most of the questions that the developer would ask, or the way that he would assess the library, would be in terms of functional, right? Does it do what I need? Maybe in terms of, is it written in a language that I can understand? What's the status of the documentation, right? Can I go ahead and implement it fast? And not many developers actually ask the security question. I mean, how secure is this component? How well is it maintained? Are they releasing patches to security vulnerability as they come up along the way? And I think that these are one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves when coding. And as developers, we need to ask them. And as development managers, we need to make sure that this assessment is being done by the developers themselves, of course. We're not looking for the traditional model where the security team had to actually approve each and every one of the components. We want the developers to be able to answer these questions by themselves. The next thing is to automatically open pull requests for patches. So the reality is that almost every open source vulnerability out there is already being patched and has a remediation or a fix in the next version, one of the next versions of that open source component. So continuously patching and making sure that we are on the latest open source version of the components that you're using helps mitigate almost each and every one of the open source security vulnerabilities. So if there is one tip that you can take is patch your software and make sure that you're on the latest version of your open source components. And one way to do it automatically, as we're speaking automation here, is to automatically open pull requests when there is a fix for a known vulnerability. And you can either automatically merge it or you can manually do it. Of course, you have to have the automated tests in place to make sure it doesn't break anything. But this is the first point. We can also do things like restrict merges if there are vulnerabilities, meaning that development teams didn't do their job as they should have and maybe chose a component that has a vulnerability or are using an older version of that open source. The next thing is the build step. And in the build step, we want to be able to scan for vulnerabilities in every build. We also want to be able to fail builds, similar to the way that builds are failing since there are functional bugs. We want to be able to fail them based on policies. It can be your organizational policies. For example, one organization can decide that it's only high severity vulnerabilities that would fail the build. Another organization can decide that security vulnerabilities are not acceptable at all and they just fail builds if there is any security vulnerability. So it's really up to the policy, and this policy is up to the security teams. The next thing is the package. So again, scanning is the key here, and we want to be aware of the vulnerabilities. So detection is really important. We want to be able to scan Docker images, either in public and private registries. So a common practice would be to take an image from Docker Hub or a public image registry and then maybe bring it into your private registry. So in that process, one of the things that you can do is scan the image to make sure that it doesn't have any vulnerability. And the deployment is sort of the right part here, but still very important. We want to keep on scanning. So scanning for vulnerabilities is not a one-time thing. It's something that we do all the time. And of course, the monitoring is also very important. So monitoring, running apps for newly published vulnerabilities, as new vulnerabilities basically come up every day. And even if you were yesterday in the last version of that open source component, something can come up today. So really important to keep on monitoring that. And then the next slide, just to sort of conclude here. So I think that one of the most important things is to reduce the friction. And we spoke a lot about this friction between security and development teams. And one of the best practices here would be to assign someone from within the organization that is sort of your AppSec Champion, someone that has this control in the organization that can sort of drive the awareness within the organization, can make sure that the teams have the right skills, and he can prioritize the tasks, and also be responsible for the communication within the organization, right? Because friction between security and development is something that is sort of inherent in their roles, right? Developers, they want to move on to the next feature, they want to develop the next thing, and security are more risk averse. They want to make sure that what is working now is free of vulnerabilities, that it's secure, that it's safe, and they're not very happy to move on to the next thing. So having that champion can definitely help bridge the gap between the teams. And with that, I believe that we have some time. So first of all, we have some basic discussion points for things that we maybe didn't discuss enough, and we believe that are main keys to drive DevSecOps in enterprise organizations. So I think the first one is, how do we really scale DevSecOps with the small security teams? And the reality in most organizations is that there are many developers, but very few security experts. And security is an expertise. And my answer to that would sort of be something that I said before, but maybe I'll emphasize that. The security teams, they have the knowledge, they have the expertise. They are the ones who have to set the policy for the organization and drive the DevSecOps process. They need to have the visibility, and they need to sort of evaluate the process as we go on. But the actual ownership of that, of the day-to-day job needs to be for development, or for the DevSecOps person within the development teams, maybe that champion of the development teams that is responsible to drive the security aspect in that. Brian, anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first I agree with you fully, and then I'd also say what I've recommended and helped clients implement in terms of managing what is also a mismatch, right? Your operations, release management, or application deployment teams are often also well outnumbered by development. And what I often recommend practically that aligns with you is you take that domain expert, in this case AppSec, and you assign that domain expert to multiple application or project teams, so that they're able to be involved up front in analyzing requirements as they're being developed, developing user stories to cover the security checks and requirements, and basically, rotate across teams. And progressively over time, you'll actually get a scaling benefit, right? Your small team will be able to hand off more knowledge and more responsibility to the development teams. So increasingly, they are establishing repeatable processes and lessening the day-to-day cognitive load on them to reactively address security issues. I'll go ahead and start on the next question and take the next question, Shiri. Different teams have different security requirements. How do we support that? In the interest of time, I'll simply state, this speaks back to what I think Siva or somebody in the questions had brought up, the importance of security as code. And once you're able to embed security into your automation process, establish key security activities as Shiri outlined, and implement those as phase gates, what you should be looking to do is to work with your security office and your various development teams to identify what are the shared or corporate security requirements and tools to support those, and codify those into a base or template or template pipeline or workflow. But then support and implement facilities or branches of that pipeline for teams to also leverage tech stack, application, or team-specific tools and processes as part of their pipeline. And Shiri, I'd like to ask you, what roles do metrics and KPIs have in DevSecOps implementation?
So I think we discussed it briefly, but really something that I would like to focus on. So one of the things with DevSecOps is that it's sort of not very easy to analyze because specifically in large enterprises, we hear about things when things get wrong, we hear about it. But usually when, yeah, I remediated a security vulnerability, I mean, this is not very interesting. And this is why we have to put the metrics in place. So some questions that I would ask is, first of all, as I said, am I getting better or worse in handling security vulnerabilities? And I can judge that by, first of all, the pace. I mean, how long does it take me to remediate a security vulnerability from the moment that the development teams saw it to the moment that the fix is deployed to production? And we want that time to be as minimal as we can. The second thing that we can do is we can, for example, measure how many builds failed due to a security issue, right? If we're saying that we're eliminating security vulnerabilities as part of planning and coding in the IDE, we shouldn't have any security vulnerabilities in the build stage. So ideally, these are one of the two KPIs or metrics that I would measure as security KPIs for the implementation.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and advance to Q&A.
All right, guys, we have gotten some questions in. There's a couple minutes left for question and answer period. So if you do want to submit a question, please go ahead and do so. And if we don't get to your question during the webinar, please know that the folks at WhiteSource will be getting a copy of all of the questions. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Let's dive right on into what we've got. Okay, so let's see, we've got a couple comments in here. One is SecOps need to be a part of every phase of the software development lifecycle. I'm confused. I think that was probably a comment about your being contrary at the beginning of the webinar, Brian. So.
Yes, that was my troublemaking, Charlene. And Charlene, do know that I've been answering the questions all the way up to probably the sixth to last throughout the presentation.
All right, great. Would be helpful for the audience in general, though, if we could maybe do some of those as well that you've already answered. But here's a comment. DevSecOps depends on the need. If there is a need for TTM DevSecOps, is an end-to-end dev team. You build it, you run it. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I'll defer to Shiri to see if Shiri, you have thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely think that DevSecOps depends on the need. I think that one of the things we specifically emphasized here is that, I mean, we showed some software development processes as examples for ones that can either, you know, be part of your organization or not. And it's up to the security teams to actually analyze, you know, your organization best, right? You know what are the tools that it needs. And this is more to give you a clue of how DevSecOps looks like and the best practices. But of course, it depends on the need. So this is, I think, what I think about this.
All right, great. Here's a great question for you guys. How about building the threat modeling to identify a security process and identify the things you need to protect in your product?
So I'll lead with that, and then maybe Shiri will add in. You know, the how about, I think my answer is 100% absolutely, right? And this does speak back to what Shiri said about involving the AppSec experts and potentially involving them early, right? I think as we kind of scope out the initial product and then additional capabilities, we need to be continually looking at the impact of that on potential threats and actually planning in threat modeling activities as requirements or stories.
I definitely agree. I think that, threat modeling is super important, and really you have to identify issues during planning if you can. I mean, this is one of the things that iterative improvement, maybe at the beginning you won't be able to identify the risks while you plan the project. But as you progress, one of the things that you want to do is to sort of shift left in when you are aware to a security vulnerability, and definitely make sure that, I mean, if you identify a gap, either you can prevent it. I mean, maybe you can take a different library and just prevent that risk of being exposed to a security vulnerability. But if you took that library, yes, of course, fixing during the development phase would be the best thing to do. I mean, you would upgrade to the next non-vulnerable version.
All right, great. I think we have time for one or two more. Let's see, here's a good one. How do you sell security improvements to management? I struggled a lot just to implement WhiteSource Bolt.
Shiri, I defer to you on that.
Yeah, so this is definitely a great question. I think that selling this to management can sometimes be not a very easy task, right? So selling security improvements to management is all about those metrics and KPIs that I just mentioned, right? If you have the way to show the management that you reduce the risk to the minimum, that you have the right reports to show that, we were exposed to 1,000 security vulnerabilities last month, and now we only are exposed to 100. That's a great improvement, and management should definitely appreciate it. I also think that once management understands that security is slowing down the pace of development, this is the key challenge here, because once they understand that, and they understand that they can actually save cost and save time by implementing DevSecOps, that would be, I would assume, very easy to implement that.
All right, great. Well, we are about 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so unfortunately that's all the time that we have for question and answer period. As I said before, if we did not get to your question, I'm very sorry, but we are planning on sending all of the questions over to the folks at WhiteSource, so I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered. So thank you to everybody who did submit questions. Also, a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of the presentation, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, real quick before we shut things down, I did mention at the top of the hour we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So let's go ahead and get that done. Our first winner today is Susie G. Congratulations, Susie. Yay! Our second winner today is, let's see, Amy F. Congratulations, Amy. Our third winner today is, let's see, Bryson O. Congratulations, Bryson. And our final winner today is Dave N. with an N, like Nancy. Congratulations, Dave. We will be reaching out to all 4 of you via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see anything in your inbox, please check the spam folder. Shiri, Brian, as always, great presentation, so much good information. You guys always just knock it out of the park. So thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. And judging from the number of questions we got from the audience, lots of good stuff, man. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Also, really appreciate the audience for joining me today. As always, But for now, I am Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.